Hello. Hello. Malcolm Brady here of Dublin City University. I'm going to talk to you today about analysis, the analysis phase of strategy making, in particular external analysis, and in particular looking at the economic characteristics of the industry that you're competing in, and looking at the macro environment of that industry as well. So there are two things we're going to look at today. So we'll start with the economic characteristics. And this is an example from the ice cream industry from the Ben and Jerry's case study, as you'll see. Just take away the ice cream for a moment and we can see a bit more clearly. Um, so here we're looking at various different economic characteristics, a whole series of them on the left-hand side of the screen here. And on the right-hand side, there's the kind of value, let's call it, of that characteristic for that ice cream industry in the USA. And I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through some of the major ones because these are important now in their own right, but they're also important for the industry level analysis or Porter's five forces analysis later on. So they serve several purposes. So first of all, the market size from the case study, it was sized at 10 billion, so pretty large industry, although not enormous. The growth rate of the industry, and this is critical because this, much depends on whether the industry is emerging or in its growth stage or its mature stage or indeed its stagnant or declining stage. In this case, it's mature, low growth, so that's usually 2 to 3% per annum increase in size of the market. So that's a mature type industry. It's important to know the nature of the industry. Or where it is in its life cycle. Geographic scope means, broadly speaking, do firms see themselves as at national level or at regional level or at simply town or local level, like say a car repair shop or barbers, they'd be local level, okay? The computer industry, the laptop industry is global. It sells to the whole world and much the same product to the whole world. The level of rivalry. So how many competitors and what's their nature? In this case, it's said to be 10 large competitors. So that gives you a good indication. That'll be a fairly competitive industry with 10 large people competing for the industry, as opposed to say one dominant firm, or on the other hand, say 1,000 small firms. Who are the buyers? The buyer characteristics of the buyers. In this case, consumers, but it could be other industry, could be the buyer, it could be a business to business company, so you're selling to other businesses. In this case, it's consumer product. And how easy is it to get into the industry and to get out of the industry? In this case, low barriers to entry and presumably low barriers to exit as well. But some industries are very difficult to get into because they require, for example, particular knowledge or particular resources to get in the first place, or large budgets or whatever. Some are hard to get out of. For example, oil refining or cement production and so on. These are big plants that require decommissioning and so on if you're exiting the industry. So there's a lot of costs to exit. So in that case, it's often easier or more economical to actually stay in the industry, even at a low level of profitability, than to exit and incur all the decommissioning costs. Scale, economies, and experience effects I'm going to come to in a few minutes, so I won't say any more about that. The level of product differentiation. In other words, is the industry largely selling a fairly standardized product, or are the products very different to each other? In this case, there's a reasonable level of differentiation, low-fat products, chunky products, products with fruit mixed in, and so on. Okay, so there's a lot of differentiation. Chocolate industry, chocolate bar industry would be the same, lots of different types because people have different tastes. The level of integration that may be taking place in the industry. In other words, how easy is it for firms in the industry to integrate forward into the chain of the buyer company? And in this case, we're seeing some level of forward integration with ice cream manufacturers setting up outlets for their products. Ben & Jerry's or Haagen-Dazs or whatever, setting up their own retail outlets. Murphy's in Ireland do the same thing. Okay, so they're selling their own product, and that's a level of forward integration. So a reasonable level of that taking place. Backward integration would be where the firm producing the product moves back into the industry of its suppliers. So for example, if Murphy's down in Dingle, bought up cattle or dairy farms to produce their own milk for their own ice cream products. And there can be reasons for doing this, to be sure of supply or to ensure a consistent supply of particular type of high fat milk or whatever it is. There can be reasons to backward integrate and reasons to forward integrate and reasons to disintegrate as well. Okay? And these can change over time also. I leave the other elements, capacity, utilization, profitability, to get a sense of how profitable the industry is. The 5 forces model will look more closely at that. Capacity utilization tells us how easy it is to, whether it's going to be attractive to enter or not. If there's a lot of excess capacity in the industry, it makes entry difficult because the existing firms can scale up to meet any increased demand, and new competitors may not get a space. And technological change in this industry, it's said to be low, but in other industries, it could be said to be high. And our PESTLE analysis will also look at this level of technological change. So there are the economic characteristics of, say, an industry, but in particular, the ice cream industry in North America. I mentioned 2 particular features, economies of scale and experience effects, and I'll also mention economies of scope as well. But these 3 economies have tended to lead firms to become larger or want to become larger, because when they're larger, they gain these economies of scale or they gain these experience effects if they become large quickly. And that means their unit costs come down, and that can make them more profitable. Okay, greater, they can have higher margins with lower unit costs. So there's an incentive for firms, or there has traditionally been an incentive for firms to become larger. Whether these truly exist is another matter, and whether they exist to the extent that firms expect or anticipate is another matter. And there are diseconomies of scale as well. When you become overly large, you become overly complex, bureaucratic, you can stagnate a little bit. It can become difficult to get things done, and in fact your costs can increase at a certain point. So there's a middle place where economies of scale are good, and that's what firms are seeking generally. So the sources of economies of scale, I've listed 4 there: indivisibilities, specialization, inventory, and physical economies of scale, or engineering economies of scale, sometimes they're called. So indivisibilities are where you spread a particular cost that can't be broken down, but larger firms can spread that cost over a greater volume. So, for example, if you have a retail outlet and you need to employ a manager for that retail outlet, if a firm down the road has a retail outlet 5 times that size, it probably still only needs 1 manager to manage that retail outlet, even though it's 5 times the size. So the cost of that manager is spread over 5 times the volume of business. So that can be an economy of scale for the larger retailer. Okay, due to that indivisibility, it's difficult to have half a manager, although some firms can divide a manager's time among different outlets and so on. But in general, it's difficult to have half of a manager. And there are certain things you can't really have half of. So those indivisibilities lead to economies of scale. Specialization is something slightly different. But again, it's to do with an indivisibility in the sense that larger firms can employ specialists. So a small firm starting off will have a general manager who has to probably do some of the marketing, who has to do some of the research and development, some of the HR work, some of the operations work. So the general manager is doing all of these kinds of things, and he can't be, or she can't be, good at all things. Generally, we're not good at everything. So as the firm grows larger, it can employ specialists, a specialist HR person to look after the staff, a specialist operations manager to just devote his or her time to that task, specialist marketers. So, and in general, because those specialists have specialist knowledge, they are better at doing that work than the general manager who doesn't have that specialist knowledge, and therefore they are more productive in that role. But only larger firms can afford that kind of specialist labor. Okay. So the larger they are, the more specialists they can employ, and therefore the theory is therefore the more productive they become. Inventory is, again, just with larger sizes, you don't need quite so much inventory to cover the probability of a stock out. And physical sources are, for example, a gas pipeline, say that's 200 mil diameter, will cost you a certain amount to install or fabricate and install in the ground. Pipe that's, say, 400 mil diameter, double the size, may not cost twice as much to install in the ground, because much of the work of building or constructing that pipeline is fixed indivisibilities, they're fixed. So they're not much more to when they may not be double, for example, just because you double the size, the double diameter of the pipe. But in doubling the diameter of the pipe, the volume of gas you can put through that pipe goes up by the square of the radius, the square of the diameter, and therefore you can push much more gas through, even though it doesn't cost you that much more to construct. So there's a kind of physical or an engineering source of an economy of scale. And these exist in, as you can see in the points below, in various areas of the business. It can be in marketing, they can be in production, they can be in research and development, they can be in distribution. So they can be in different areas, and there can be different levels of scale economies in these different areas. And you can see the last point there can be economies of scale in finance and as well, in the sense that bigger firms can get better financial rates from when they're borrowing money than smaller firms, because they're seen as more substantial, more robust, more reliable, less risky. So they can get better. So simply size gives you that type of advantage. Also in terms of non-market strategies, dealing with governments and so on, large companies tend to have the ear of the government in a way that small firms just don't have. For example, if the MD of ABC, Acme company comes to Ireland, nobody takes any great notice. If the MD of Apple comes to Ireland, the Taoiseach takes notice and may even meet the leader of Apple, for example, if he comes to the country. So you can see larger firms have clout in a way that smaller firms don't necessarily have. So there can be these kind of economies of scale. Experience effects, then, on the other hand, is related, similar, but not exactly the same. They're to do with the amount you produce, as opposed to just simply your size. So they're to do with cumulative production volume, and that builds up over time. So experience effect builds up over time, whereas the scale economy is just what you are at that point in time, how big you are at that point in time. And you can see it's this kind of exponential decay type curve. So you get a lot of the gains in the first couple of doublings of production, and less gains as you go on. So you can see in this little graph here, at 1 million of production, units of production, it's $1 per unit cost of production. If you double to 2 million, that reduces. If, say, your experience effect is, say, 20%, that doubles it reduces by 20%. And after two more doublings to 4 million and then to 8 million, you're down to 51 cents at an experience curve of 20% gain in doubling. You're down to 50 cents, which is about half of your initial unit cost. So you can see the effect is quite substantial, particularly in the early stages. The next doubling won't happen until 16 million units of production, and it'll be a reduction of 20% of 50 cents. So, the gains get less as you go along, okay? They're diminishing returns, but still they're very useful at the beginning. So it's important to gain these effects if you can. So hence, firms that get large faster gain the experience effect, and firms that are large have economies of scale up to a certain point. As I say, there can be diseconomies of scale after a certain point, and experience gains diminish as time goes on as well. So there are limits to these advantages, but they've led to the belief that firms should grow and should get large, and that drives a lot of firm behavior growth. And I'll just give us some simple examples of scale economies and experience effects and economies of scope. This is at time of recording, it's end of October. Now, in about 6 months' time, at the end of April, the grass, spring has sprung and grass has riz and needs to be cut. So somewhere in April, you go down to your shed, and it'll take you a couple of hours to do that first cut of the grass, because you have to find the key of the shed, you have to take out all the stuff that accumulated over winter, you have to take out the lawnmower, clean it, oil it, and so on. And then you have to remember how you did the grass up and down or around in circles or whatever way you did it, So the first time takes a couple of hours. By the end of the summer, you have that down to a fine art. You know exactly where the machine is. It's well oiled. It's you know exactly the route you should take around your garden, and you have it down to 40 minutes, whatever. So that's an experience effect. That's because you've got better at doing it as you went along. A scale effect would be where you have, let's say, a small garden, 20 square meters, and your neighbor has a big garden. He's got 200 square meters, so huge garden. Now your neighbor. All those overheads about getting the lawnmower out of the shed, cleaning it, doing the doing the cutting and then putting the lawnmower back into the shed, all of that beginning and ending work is common to both gardens, much the same. And but in the smaller garden, it's spread over a much smaller number of, say, blades of grass to be cut than it is in the larger garden. So the a second economy of scale could be that in the large garden, you're going down in straight lines for a long time and only taking a corner for every, say, 20 or 30 meters. And the corner is the slow part. Whereas in the small garden, you're taking that corner every 3 meters. So you're slowing down much more. So both of those two things give you the indivisibilities in terms of the shed and the cleaning and all that, and then the actual long line of production that you get in the long run of cutting. So all of that leads to your neighbor getting much better value per, much lower cost per blade of grass cut than you do. And that's because he has the larger garden. Now, scale up again to another neighbor who has an acre or 2 acres of garden. That neighbor now can get, for example, a whole new technology. You can get a ride-on motor or a power motor, and that really eats up the grass. So again, he can get a much lower cost per blade of grass at a fairly, okay, there's an initial capital investment in the equipment, but after that, he's getting a much better cost per blade of grass than either of the other two, okay? But only he can avail of that technology. It isn't, you can't use a power motor in your small garden. There isn't space to turn it, for example, or even get it in. So that technology is available to the larger scale operator. And then when you go to football stadiums or the Phoenix Park, whatever, you now are drawing you're using a tractor and you've a set of cutting blades 6 meters across or 10 meters across, and they're really eating up the grass, okay? But that's another level of scale again and another level of technology. But all of these are leading to the larger scale you're operating at, the lower your unit cost. The final element here is economies of scope. There are now, say your shed in your back garden that you're using to store your lawnmower. Well, that shed can have other purposes, can be used for, let's call it, other business lines, not just cutting grass, but also, for example, storing the table and chairs for sitting out in the sun, or storing the camping equipment, or storing your bicycle. So let's regard all of those as different lines of business. Well, that one shed covers the cost of those as well, or is shared over those other lines of businesses, not just the grass cutting business, let's say. So that's an economy of scope where you have an overhead that's shared among multiple product lines, let's call it, as opposed to over more units of grass being cut, which is the same product line, but just more of it. Okay, so there's an economy of scope when you're sharing it over multiple product lines, an economy of scale where you're sharing it over larger volume of the same product. And the final thing I want to talk about is environmental scanning, or the large scale, the macro analysis. And here is our PESTLE model. And you can see PESTLE straight away as a checklist: political, economic, social, cultural, technological, legal, ecological, or environmental. It's covering the full ground of factors out there in the environment that might affect our industry in some fashion or other, where things can change and they might affect us. So essentially, it's a checklist. The important thing there is that you need to pick out things that are in these, going on in these spheres that are relevant to your industry. And even if they're relevant, even if it's irrelevant to the industry, you need to spell out in what way. For example, currently in Ireland, Brexit is a big political change taking place, and indeed with economic ramifications as well. But Brexit is different for different industries. For some industries, it's potentially catastrophic. For other industries, it could be a bonus, it could be an advantage, it could be positive. And so you need to specify in what way is Brexit detrimental, or is it a political, is it a change resulting from a political effect? And in what way does that impact on our industry? So in what way does Brexit impact on the beef industry if you're the beef industry? Or what way does it impact on the dairy industry if you're in the dairy industry, or the tourism industry? Because it affects these different industries in different ways. So just simply saying Brexit is not sufficient. You need to spell out exactly how it's going to impact on your industry. And similarly for all the other changes going on there. So essentially, as I say, PESTLE analysis is a checklist, but it's still critical to work out exactly in what way it impacts on your industry. And it's important to go down through each of the elements as well, because otherwise you can be myopic. You can miss out on a change that could be relevant because you just don't think it's relevant. But when you go through the checklist, it forces you to think of what might be relevant. Remember, Microsoft famously didn't note the importance of the internet. I mean, they were aware it was going, there was something technically taking place out there, this network of computers, but they didn't really perceive the full implications of the internet when it was originally coming out. They obviously did, after a while, but initially they didn't. And, that could have allowed other competitors get some advantage over Microsoft because it wasn't aware of a change that actually was going to make an enormous difference to their industry. The second technique in this level is scenario analysis. And that's where, just quoting from Grant here, where rather than using just single point forecasts into the future, you propose various different scenarios going into the future, and you use those scenarios to generate possibilities and then options or responses to those possibilities, and that widens your scope, widens your decision making, fosters alertness, as he says here, and increases responsiveness or resilience for your company because you're taking into account more things that might happen. I have two clips that you can link to here on this slide. One is the artist from The Artist. It's a short 1-minute clip, but it's where the artist, who was, if you remember the film, he was top dog in the silent movie era. He was a performer and absolutely at the top of his game in that industry. And then talkies came in, sound came in, and the short clip just shows where he, where he begins to realize the full implications of sound. And he also realized that he doesn't have the capabilities to really perform well at that level. His skills are linked with silent movies and sort of actions and expressions and so on, but not voice. So he realizes suddenly, instantaneously, just that his skills are becoming redundant almost overnight. So that was a paradigm shift in that industry and totally changed the nature of the movie industry, as did colour at some time later. The second one down at the bottom there is the global trends analysis by the National Intelligence Council in the USA. And they do this, they bring out this report that's publicly available every 4 years at the advent of a new president or a new presidency. And they look at global trends. Now, this is really, really macro level analysis, but it's quite interesting reading. And effectively, it is a PESTLE analysis, but just on a macro scale and in terms of how it might impact on the USA Inc. Okay, so it's worth having a look at that. And as I say, it comes out every 4 years. So presumably, once the November election takes place, we'll have a new one out fairly shortly. This one is obviously about 4 years old at this stage. And then the final slide here is this is a recent article in Knowledge at Wharton, where Hendrickson Struggles look at potential scenarios for responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, at the early stages of the pandemic in March and April, many organizations were going through various different scenarios. Suddenly people found scenario analysis an attractive tool to use. It would be kind of one of the Cinderella tools of the strategy toolbox, but it was brought out with a vengeance in March and April of this year. And essentially, they use 2 dimensions now to propose different scenarios. How well the economy will recover, will it rebound, or will it remain in or stay in a recession? Or what level of social trust will it maintain? Will it remain high, as it was at the beginning of the pandemic in many countries, or will it return or go to a low level where people don't trust each other and don't trust the government? And those 2 dimensions give you a 4-quadrant set of scenarios. I won't go through them. You can follow this source yourselves to look at the details of it. But essentially, there are 4 quite different scenarios. And the idea is, if you think of the impacts of, take each scenario in turn and look at how your firm might respond in such a situation, if such a scenario arises. And you do that for all 4 scenarios, some of which would be positive, some of which may not be positive, some of which may be neutral enough, But essentially, you're looking at how you might respond under different scenarios. it's not that any one scenario is going to come out. That's not the point of scenario analysis. The point is that you're forced to think of plausible scenarios, things that could potentially happen. You know, they're not far-fetched or not entirely far-fetched. They're just following a particular trend to its more logical, maybe even unattractive limit, and what would happen then. And it forces you to think about how to deal with possible futures. And it may force you to bring in some redundancy and increase resilience in certain areas that you mightn't have done otherwise. But you might just say, well, that scenario isn't all that likely, but it, you know, could happen, and therefore we should prepare in this particular way. So hence scenario analysis. And I say it's had a resurgence over the last 6 months due to the current pandemic crisis situation. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you again for listening, and I'll come back with another session on other analysis tools. Thank you.